Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to try something a little different, venture into unknown territory. We're going to do a book review, but I'm going to do it face to face with you. It's a little strange, I'm not used to this whole camera thing, so bear with me. And to make matters even a little more strange, we're actually reviewing an audiobook. So, the book we're reviewing today is The Troop by Nick Cutter, and the audiobook specifically is narrated by Corey Brill. The Troop was an interesting one. If you've ever read Lord of the Flies when you were in high school, it's kind of reminiscent to that, except add in some extra disgusting, horrifying elements. So, the troop begins on Flagstaff Island, which is this tiny 12 square mile island off the coast of PEI, a province here in Canada. Already getting bonus points for being set in Canada. You don't find a whole lot of those these days. The story begins when Tim, a scoutmaster, takes his group of teenage scouts to this island for a weekend expedition to earn some more badges and, do that scout-related stuff. Things are going pretty well to start out the weekend for Tim and the boys. That is until a stranger shows up and knocks on their cabin door asking for some food. Now, this stranger kind of looks human but is barely recognizable as such. What the troop and Tim don't know is that this man's been infected with a parasite.
A genetically engineered parasite
that eats its host from the inside out and just drives it to eat more and more food, feeding the parasite, but eventually whittling the host away until they die. This parasite too is highly contagious, but again, Tim and the boys don't know this. Things go as you kind of think they would. There's not a lot of surprise when it comes to what happens to Tim and the boys. They get infected, things get progressively worse. But what Nick Cutter, the author, does that kind of adds a twist is play with the psychology of the boys. Similar to Lord of the Flies, these kids are stuck on an island and the military eventually quarantines off the island, not letting anyone in or out. And that starts to drive some power plays and reveal the true nature of some of the kids. Now, it's some of the characters of the kids that either really drive the book forward or hinder a little bit of it. So among the boys, you have Kent, who is your typical jock, and you have Newt, who is your typical chubby nerd. And I don't know what happened to Nick Cutter when he was younger, but he seems to really, really hate both of these groups. And it really comes through in the first third of the book that jocks are assholes and nerds are just sad and can't stand up for themselves, and he kind of drives that point too far. And when he goes through this book, when he's writing, one of Nick Cutter's strengths is how descriptive he is, and that really plays up the horror element. But when he's just describing how much of a jerk one boy is or how much of a loser another boy is, it gets a little overdone. The other boys are Ephraim, Max, and Shelley. Now, Ephraim and Max are best friends, and through this whole ordeal, their friendship is really put to the test. And Shelley is, what's the best way to put this? The main driver of the story, because Shelley is a psychopath, for lack of a better term. And that's not spoiling anything, because I don't want to spoil anything. But Shelley quickly tells the audience how truly twisted he is. And that's one of the things that bothers me about this book so much, but also kind of pushes this book to the next level. So Shelley, this soon-to-be psychopath, describes in vivid detail how he tortured and murdered his household cat, and how there are certain times in the book where he finds other animals and tortures them too. And just the amount of excruciating detail put into the scenes where Shelley is torturing an animal is sickening. It actually made me feel ill at points, which was a big negative for me in this book. But again, also kind of a positive, because this book was meant to be disgusting. It was meant to be stomach churning, and it definitely hit the note on that one. That being said, though, when it comes to the torture of innocent animals, I'm still not a huge fan of it. There are other scenes in the book where the kids are forced to do things that are also described in such vivid detail that being in the car and listening to this in an audiobook, I almost felt like I had to pull over. It was gross. And I think if you want to read The Troop, you really need to go into it knowing that you're going to feel uneasy. Especially if you're listening to the audiobook. Corey Brill, the narrator for the audiobook, does an incredible job. His voice is very unique. His cadence and his pacing is very, very unique. And I don't know if I would have been able to enjoy this book as much as I did if Corey Brill wasn't narrating it. The fact that he put so much effort into slowing things down and pacing out the most disgusting, horrific things made it that much better and that much almost more enjoyable than if I was reading it. I feel like if I was reading this book myself, I get so grossed out, I'd close the book, probably not finish it, to be honest. It's written fairly well. The prose is good, but it was this narration that really made me stick through it because the way that he told it was incredible. One of the other positives about the book was that at the end of almost every chapter, we had an addendum put on. And these addendums were either evidence from a case or diary entries or court transcripts or interviews. And they were all very interesting and added an extra element to the story by giving us a glimpse into what happened after the event while we were still trying to figure out what was going on during the event. And while that might seem like it spoils it a little, it plays into it well in building up the suspense. There's this one line in one of the addendums to the chapters where it's referenced how many kids get off the island. And as we get closer and closer to the end of the book, and it's an 11-hour story when you're listening to it in audiobook form, then you start worrying, hey, there are still too many kids. One or two of you have got to go, and who's it going to be? And it builds that suspense up because you're constantly on edge about which kid won't make it off the island. So I'm well aware that the troop won't be for everyone. And if you look at the reviews of it, people are pretty split. They either love it or they hate it. And I think I fall somewhere in the middle. Because it was so graphic and gut-wrenching and nauseating, it was very difficult to finish at points, but it was still a very engaging story. And again, I lend that a lot to the narrator, to Corey Brill. The writing was descriptive, the writing was good, don't get me wrong, it was just difficult. So, breaking it down, I'm going to give The Troop by Nick Cutter, the actual story, I'm going to give 3.5 out of 5 stars. Solid, good horror. If you really like, the more queasy, I can barely stand to read this, but it's also entertaining me vibe, then I say go pick it up. But when it comes to the audiobook, when it comes to Corey Brill narrating it, I give this a 5 out of 5. It was so engaging. I couldn't wait to listen to more. I would hang out in my car for 5 or 10 minutes after work just to finish a chapter because he had me so locked into it. So if you're looking for an audiobook and a horror and you're okay squirming and gripping your steering wheel pretty tight when you're listening to it in a car, then I definitely recommend The Troop by Nick Cutter.